The steady hum of medical equipment filled the sterile room at Westfield General Hospital as Dylan Hayes clutched the crumpled bill in his trembling hands, $127,000, for his 8-year-old daughter Sophie's emergency surgery. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he whispered, watching her peaceful face as she recovered, knowing he couldn't afford even a fraction of the cost. His construction job barely covered rent, let alone this crushing debt that would destroy their future. Just then, Harper Lane, the night shift nurse who had been unusually kind to them, quietly entered the room. What Dylan didn't know was that Harper carried a secret that could change everything. She was the estranged daughter of Dr. William Thornton, the wealthy hospital owner who had built his empire while abandoning his family years ago. When Harper saw the desperation in Dylan's eyes, she faced an impossible choice. What would you do if you discovered the power to save a desperate father, but it meant confronting the man who destroyed your past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in room 314 of Westfield General Hospital cast harsh shadows across Dylan Hayes' weathered face as he stared at the medical bill that would destroy his life. $127,000. The numbers blurred together as tears threatened to spill from his exhausted eyes. His 8-year-old daughter Sophie lay sleeping peacefully in the hospital bed, her small chest rising and falling steadily after the emergency appendectomy that had saved her life just 3 days ago. Dylan's calloused hands, marked by years of construction work, trembled as he folded the bill and shoved it into his jacket pocket. He couldn't let Sophie see his fear when she woke up. She had already been through enough the sudden, excruciating pain that had doubled her over during breakfast, the terrifying ambulance ride, the hours of surgery while Dylan paced the waiting room, praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sophie was alive and recovering beautifully, according to Dr. Martinez, who had performed the surgery. But this bill would finish what poverty had started. Dylan made $38,000 a year framing houses for Henderson Construction. After rent, groceries, and Sophie's basic needs, he was lucky to have $50 left at the end of each month. Even if he worked every day for the next 4 years and spent nothing on himself, he still couldn't pay half of what he owed. His phone buzzed with yet another text from his landlord, Mrs. Patterson. Rent was due yesterday. Third notice. Dylan closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. They were already 2 months behind on rent, and he'd been picking up extra shifts just to buy groceries. Now this, the hospital's financial coordinator, a stern woman named Janet, had already explained the payment plans available. Even the most generous option would require monthly payments larger than his entire paycheck. Sophie stirred in her sleep, and Dylan immediately moved to her bedside, smoothing her auburn hair away from her face. She looked so much like her mother, Rebecca, especially when she slept. Rebecca, who had died in a car accident when Sophie was only 2 years old, leaving Dylan to navigate single parenthood with nothing but love and determination. He'd managed for 6 years, somehow always finding a way to make ends meet. But this was different. This was impossible. The sound of soft footsteps in the hallway caught his attention. Through the partially open door, he could see the night shift nurse, Harper Lane, checking on other patients. She moved with a grace that seemed out of place in the sterile hospital environment, and there was something about her that Dylan couldn't quite put his finger on. Unlike the other nurses who seemed constantly rushed and overwhelmed, Harper always took time to really listen to patients and their families. She had been the one to sit with Sophie during those first scary hours after surgery, reading her stories and making her laugh despite the pain. "Mr. Hayes?" Harper appeared in the doorway, her voice gentle. "I brought you some coffee from the good machine down in the staff lounge. The stuff from the visitor's vending machine tastes like motor oil." Dylan looked up, surprised by the kindness. "You didn't have to do that." I mean, I appreciate it, but you've been here for 3 straight days, Harper interrupted, stepping into the room with a steaming cup. You need to take care of yourself too, or you won't be any good to Sophie when she really needs you. Something in her tone made Dylan study her face more carefully. Harper appeared to be in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and warm brown eyes that seemed to see everything. There was an intelligence there, and a sadness. That reminded Dylan of his own struggles. Most nurses he'd encountered were professional but distant. Harper felt different, like she genuinely cared about what happened to them. Thank you, Dylan said, accepting the coffee gratefully. The warmth spread through his hands, and he realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a real meal. Sophie really likes you. She's been asking when the nice nurse Harper would be back. Harper's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire appearance. She's a special kid. Brave, too. Most patients her age are much more frightened after surgery, but Sophie just wanted to know if she could still go to her friend Emma's birthday party next weekend. About that party ... double quotes. Dylan's voice trailed off. The birthday party would require a gift they couldn't afford, and gas money for the 30-minute drive to Emma's house in the suburbs. Another small thing that normal families took for granted, but felt impossible in their current situation. Harper seemed to sense his discomfort. Sophie mentioned Emma's been her best friend since kindergarten. Those friendships are important at her age. Dylan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Everything felt impossible right now. The medical debt, the overdue rent, maintaining any semblance of a normal life for Sophie. It was all crashing down at once. He took a sip of the coffee and was surprised by how good it was. Rich and smooth, nothing like the bitter hospital coffee he'd been choking down. This is really good coffee, he said, trying to change the subject. It's from the executive break room, Harper said with a slight smile. Technically, I'm not supposed to have access to it, but sometimes the overnight security guard looks the other way. There was something in the way she said it that made Dylan curious, but before he could ask what she meant, Sophie stirred and opened her eyes. Harper, Sophie's face brightened immediately. You're here. Hey, sweetheart, Harper moved to Sophie's bedside with practiced ease. How are you feeling? Better. My tummy doesn't hurt as much anymore. Daddy, did you show Harper my drawing? Dylan looked confused. What drawing, bug? Sophie pointed to the bedside table where a folded piece of paper sat next to a box of crayons that Dylan didn't remember buying. I made a picture of our family. Harper brought me the crayons yesterday. Harper looked slightly embarrassed. I happened to have some extras in my car. Sophie mentioned she liked to draw. Dylan unfolded the paper and felt his heart skip. It was a typical 8-year-old's drawing stick figures holding hands in front of a house. But what made him pause was that there were 3 figures. A tall man labeled Daddy, a smaller figure labeled Sophie, and a woman with dark hair labeled Harper. Above them, Sophie had written in careful letters, "My hospital family." The silence stretched between the 3 of them as Dylan stared at the drawing. Sophie had always been perceptive beyond her years, but this caught him completely off guard. Harper's cheeks flushed pink, and she seemed suddenly very interested in checking Sophie's IV drip. Sophie, Dylan said carefully, Harper is your nurse. She's just doing her job, taking care of you. I know, Sophie said matter-of-factly, but she feels like family. She told me about her cat, Mr. Whiskers, and how she makes pancakes shaped like animals on Sunday mornings. And she promised to teach me how to braid friendship bracelets when my hands stop being sore. Dylan looked at Harper, who was now focused intently on Sophie's chart. There was definitely more to this woman than met the eye. In his experience, hospital staff were kind but maintained professional boundaries. Harper seemed genuinely invested in Sophie's well-being, and now he was learning she'd been spending her break time talking with his daughter about personal things. Well, Dylan said finally. "It's a beautiful drawing bug. Harper, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done. Sophie's been through a lot, and having someone like you here has made all the difference." Harper met his eyes, and for a moment, Dylan saw something vulnerable there. "Sophie makes my job easier. She reminds me why I became a nurse in the first place." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Martinez for Sophie's evening checkup. But as Harper excused herself to continue her rounds, Dylan found himself watching her go with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. In 3 days, this woman had somehow become important to both him and Sophie, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to Harper Lane than she was letting on. Dylan Hayes hadn't always been counting pennies in a hospital room. 5 years ago, he had been the site supervisor for Henderson Construction's largest residential project, luxury development called Oakwood Heights, that promised to establish him as one of the most reliable contractors in the region. He owned a modest but comfortable house in Millbrook, drove a reliable truck, and had enough savings to take Sophie on weekend trips to the zoo or children's museums. Life wasn't extravagant, but it was stable and full of promise. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The transformation began with what seemed like a minor accident. Dylan was inspecting the foundation work on Lot 7 when a delivery truck carrying steel beams jackknifed on the muddy construction road. Dylan pushed his younger colleague, Kevin Shaw, out of the way just as several beams broke loose from their restraints. Kevin escaped with minor bruises, but Dylan's left leg was crushed under nearly 2 tons of steel. The physical recovery took 8 months, 3 surgeries, countless hours of physical therapy, and a permanent limp that made it impossible for him to work at his previous pace. But the financial devastation happened much faster. Dylan's health insurance covered the basic medical expenses, but not the specialized rehabilitation therapy his orthopedic surgeon recommended, not the modifications needed for his truck, not the months of lost income while he learned to walk. Again, Henderson Construction held his position as long as they could, but supervising active construction sites required someone who could climb scaffolding, navigate uneven terrain, and work 12-hour days on their feet. When Dylan finally returned to work, he was reassigned to administrative duties with a significant pay cut. The demotion stung, but Dylan told himself it was temporary. He would prove he could still contribute, still lead projects, still be the reliable supervisor he'd always been. The real crisis came 6 months later. Sophie, then 7 years old, developed a persistent cough that their family doctor initially dismissed as a seasonal bug. When the cough worsened and she began running fevers, Dylan took her to the emergency room at Westfield General. The diagnosis was pneumonia, severe enough to require a 5-day hospitalization and aggressive antibiotic treatment. That first hospital stay cost Dylan $12,000 after insurance. He emptied his savings account, cashed out his small retirement fund, and took a second mortgage on the house to cover the bills. Sophie recovered completely, but Dylan's financial security was gone. When Henderson Construction downsized 6 months later, Dylan was among the first to be let go. His supervisory experience meant nothing when companies were looking for workers who could perform physical labor at a fraction of his previous salary. The house went into foreclosure 4 months after Dylan lost his job. He'd found work with a smaller construction company, but the pay was barely half what he'd made before his accident. Dylan watched helplessly as the home where Sophie had taken her first steps, where he and Rebecca had planned their future, was sold to investors who would flip it for profit. Moving to the apartment in Riverside Gardens was supposed to be temporary. The complex was known for being affordable housing for working families, and Dylan told himself they'd only stay until he got back on his feet. That was 3 years ago. The apartment was small but clean, and Sophie had adjusted with the resilience of youth. She never complained about sharing a bedroom with her father or the fact that their dining room was a card table in the corner of the living room. Dylan picked up whatever construction work he could find, but the industry was competitive and unforgiving. Younger, stronger workers were preferred for the physically demanding jobs, while supervisory positions required connections and certifications that Dylan couldn't afford to obtain. He worked for 3 different companies in 2 years, each time hoping for stability that never materialized. The final blow came last year when Sophie started having stomach problems. What began as occasional complaints about feeling sick escalated into regular episodes where she would double over in pain, unable to eat or attend school. Dylan took her to their family doctor repeatedly, each visit adding to their mounting medical debt. Dr. Patterson ran tests, prescribed medications, and referred them to specialists, but nothing seemed to help. The specialist visits were the worst. Each appointment cost $300 up front, money Dylan had to borrow from payday loan companies at interest rates that made his situation progressively worse. The gastroenterologist ordered an upper endoscopy, a procedure that cost $4,000 and revealed nothing conclusive. A nutritionist suggested dietary changes that required expensive organic foods Dylan couldn't afford. A psychologist wondered if Sophie's symptoms might be stress-related, given their family's financial struggles. Dylan began to feel like he was failing Sophie in every possible way. Not only couldn't he provide the comfortable life she deserved, but he couldn't even figure out what was making her sick. He started working weekend shifts for a catering company, arriving at events before dawn to set up tables and staying late to clean up. The extra money helped with groceries, but it meant less time with Sophie and more worry about leaving her alone. The night before Sophie's emergency surgery, Dylan had worked an 18-hour shift at a corporate event in downtown Hartford. He'd come home exhausted, planning to spend Sunday morning making pancakes and helping Sophie with a school project about family history. Instead, he woke up to Sophie screaming in pain, her face pale and her body curled in agony. The ambulance ride to Westfield General was a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and Sophie clinging to his hand while EMTs worked around them. Dr. Martinez explained later that Sophie's appendix had been inflamed for months, likely causing all those stomach problems they'd been chasing with expensive specialists. The organ had nearly ruptured, which would have been life-threatening if they'd waited even a few more hours. The surgery went perfectly, Dr. Martinez had assured Dylan in the recovery room. She'd be completely fine in a few weeks. Kids her age bounced back quickly from appendectomies. But as Dylan stared at the itemized bill that detailed every aspect of Sophie's care, the emergency room fees, surgical costs, anesthesiology charges, pharmacy expenses, and room fees, he realized that saving Sophie's life might cost him everything else. The total was more than 3 times his annual income. Even if he worked every day for the next 5 years and spent nothing on food, rent, or basic necessities, he still couldn't pay what they owed. The collections calls had already started. 3 different departments from the hospital's billing office had contacted him, each offering payment plans that assumed Dylan had a steady income and no other expenses. The most reasonable option they presented required monthly payments of $2,000 for the next 7 years. Dylan had tried explaining his situation to Janet Morrison, the hospital's financial coordinator. She was a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled gray hair and the demeanor of someone who'd had similar conversations countless times before. "Mr. Hayes, I understand this is overwhelming," she'd said, reviewing his financial documents across her pristine desk. "But the hospital has bills to pay too. We've already discounted your charges by 30% as part of our charity care program. The payment plan I'm offering is quite generous." Generous? Dylan had struggled to keep his voice level. "Ms. Morrison, I make $38,000 a year. After rent, utilities, food, and transportation, I have maybe $200 left each month. even if I didn't buy Sophie a single piece of clothing or school supply for the next 7 years, I still couldn't make these payments. Janet had looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Have you considered a second job? Many of our patients find ways to increase their income when faced with medical expenses. Dylan wanted to laugh, but it would have come out bitter. He was already working 6 days a week in construction and picking up catering shifts on weekends. Sophie barely saw him as it was. How could he explain to this woman, sitting in her air-conditioned office wearing a suit that probably cost more than his monthly rent, that there weren't enough hours in the day to earn what they were demanding? Now sitting in Sophie's hospital room 3 days after their meeting, Dylan felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. He could declare bankruptcy, but that would destroy his credit for years and make it nearly impossible to rent decent housing or get work with construction companies that ran background checks. He could try to negotiate further with the hospital, but Janet had made it clear that 30% was their maximum discount. The other option, the one that kept him awake at night, was simply walking away, not paying the bill and dealing with the consequences. His wages could be garnished, but there were legal limits to how much they could take. It would ruin his credit and follow them for years, but at least Sophie would have a roof over her head and food on the table. As Dylan watched his daughter sleep peacefully, her color returning to normal for the first time in months, he realized that loving someone meant making impossible choices. He would figure out a way to pay this debt, even if it took the rest of his life. Sophie deserved better than a father who couldn't provide for her, but she also deserved a father who would never stop trying. The gentle sound of Harper's footsteps in the hallway interrupted his dark thoughts. For reasons he couldn't explain, her presence had become a source of comfort over the past few days. In the midst of all this chaos and uncertainty, Harper Lane represented something Dylan hadn't experienced in years: genuine human kindness with no expectation of anything in return. Harper Lane arrived at Westfield General Hospital each evening at exactly 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before her shift officially began. She used those extra minutes to review patient charts, check on supplies, and mentally prepare herself for another night of caring for people in their most vulnerable moments. But tonight, as she walked through the pristine marble lobby with its towering windows and expensive artwork, Harper felt the familiar knot of resentment tightening in her stomach. The bronze plaque near the main entrance read, "Thornton Family Medical Center, dedicated to excellence in healthcare since 1987. Below that, in smaller text, it acknowledged the generous founding donation from Dr. William Thornton and his late wife, Catherine. Harper walked past it every day without looking, but she knew every word by heart. What the plaque didn't mention was that Catherine Thornton had died alone in this very hospital while her husband was attending a medical conference in Switzerland, or that their daughter had been forbidden from visiting during her mother's final days because it might upset the patient. Harper had been 16 when her mother died. 16, and desperate to say goodbye to the woman who had raised her alone after William Thornton decided that fatherhood was incompatible with his ambitions as a cardiac surgeon. Catherine had worked as a nurse at Westfield General for 12 years, raising Harper on a single income while her ex-husband built his medical empire 20 miles away in Hartford. The irony of Harper, now working at the hospital her father owned, wasn't lost on her. She'd taken the nursing position 2 years ago, after completing her degree at the State University with student loans and scholarship money. Dr. Thornton had no idea his estranged daughter was caring for patients 3 floors below his executive office. Harper preferred it that way. She'd legally changed her last name from Thornton to Lane, her mother's maiden name, when she turned 18, and the hospital's HR department had no reason to connect the two. What they also didn't know was that Harper could have afforded to attend any university in the country. Her mother's life insurance policy and the small inheritance from Catherine's parents had left Harper with enough money to live comfortably while pursuing any career she chose. She could have studied abroad, attended prestigious private schools, or simply never worked at all. Instead, she'd chosen nursing school at the state university and deliberately sought employment at hospitals, where she could make a difference in people's lives. Harper's apartment in downtown Hartford was modest. By choice, not necessity. One bedroom, furnished with practical pieces from discount stores, decorated with photographs of her mother and artwork from local artists she'd met at coffee shops. The only expensive item was her car, a reliable Honda Accord that she'd bought, used but maintained meticulously. She lived simply, saving most of her inheritance for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. Perhaps it was insurance against an uncertain future, or maybe it was her way of honoring her mother's memory by not relying on money that had come from Catherine's suffering. The few people who knew Harper often commented on her maturity. Beyond her 27 years, what they interpreted as wisdom was actually the result of growing up with a mother who'd been forced to be both parent and provider while dealing with her own chronic health issues. Catherine had been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis when Harper was 12, a condition that gradually limited her ability to work full-time as a nurse, but never diminished her dedication to helping others. Harper had learned to cook, clean, manage household finances, and coordinate her mother's medical appointments while maintaining honor roll grades and participating in school activities. When other teenagers were worried about prom dates and college parties, Harper was researching treatment options for her mother's condition and helping Catherine with physical therapy exercises that might slow the disease's progression. The night Catherine died, Harper had been studying for her SATs in the hospital waiting room. She'd been there for 6 hours, ever since her mother was admitted with complications from her arthritis medication. Dr. Williams, the attending physician, had assured Harper that it was a routine hospitalization. They just needed to adjust Catherine's medications and monitor her kidney function for a few days. Harper was reviewing vocabulary words when the code blue alarm echoed through the hallways. She didn't think much of it until she realized the announcement was for room 412, her mother's room. By the time Harper reached the intensive care unit, Catherine was on life support, and Dr. Williams was explaining that her kidneys had failed rapidly and her heart had stopped. "We were able to restart her heart, but she's not breathing on her own," Dr. Williams had said, his voice gentle but professional. "The next 24 hours will be critical." Harper had called her father's office immediately. Dr. William Thornton was attending the International Conference on Cardiac Innovation in Geneva. According to his secretary, Ms. Rodriguez, the woman had been polite but firm. Dr. Thornton could not be reached except for absolute emergencies involving his patients at Hartford Medical Center. "This is about his ex-wife," Harper had explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "She's dying at Westfield General. He needs to know." "I'm sorry, dear," Ms. Rodriguez had replied, but Dr. Thornton was very specific about not being disturbed for personal matters during the conference. "I'm sure your mother will receive excellent care at Westfield. It's a very reputable hospital." Harper had wanted to scream that her father owned Westfield General, that he could have arranged for the best specialists in the region to consult on Catherine's case with a single phone call. Instead, she'd hung up and returned to her mother's bedside, holding Catherine's unresponsive hand while machines kept her body alive. Catherine died 36 hours later, without ever regaining consciousness. Harper was alone in the room when the monitors flatlined, and she'd pressed the call button with one hand while squeezing her mother's fingers with the other, hoping Catherine could somehow feel that she wasn't alone. Dr. Thornton had called Harper's cell phone 3 days after the funeral, having finally received Ms. Rodriguez's messages about the personal emergency. His voice was strained, and Harper could hear the guilt beneath his professional demeanor. "Harper, I'm so sorry," he'd said. "I had no idea Catherine was seriously ill." "If I had known." "You didn't want to know," Harper had interrupted, surprised. by the steadiness of her own voice. "You made it very clear years ago that Mom and I weren't your priority. Nothing's changed." "That's not fair. Your mother and I had our differences, but I never stopped caring about what happened to you both. Caring enough to pay child support when the court ordered it," Harper had replied. "But not enough to call on birthdays or attend school plays, or even answer the phone when she was dying. Don't pretend this is about love, Dad. This is about guilt." The conversation had ended with Dr. Thornton promising to make things right, and Harper hanging up before he could elaborate. She'd blocked his phone number the next day and hadn't spoken to him since. The only contact between them was an annual Christmas card that Harper returned unopened each December. Working at Westfield General was Harper's way of reclaiming something that had been stolen from her. Her mother had loved this hospital, had spoken about her patients with genuine affection. Despite the long hours and modest pay, Catherine had believed that nursing was a calling, not just a job, and that every person who entered the hospital deserved to be treated with dignity and compassion. Harper tried to embody those values in her own work, but it wasn't easy. The business side of healthcare often conflicted with the human side, especially when it came to patients like Dylan Hayes. Harper had reviewed Sophie's file and knew that the family's insurance had covered less than 60% of the surgical costs. She'd seen Dylan's reaction when Janet Morrison from billing had visited the room yesterday, watched his face go pale as the financial coordinator explained payment options that assumed resources Dylan clearly didn't have. What troubled Harper most was how preventable Sophie's crisis had been. The girl's symptoms had been classic appendicitis for months, but the family had been bounced between specialists and subjected to expensive tests that delayed the obvious diagnosis. If Dylan had been able to afford a consultation with a good pediatric surgeon months ago, Sophie could have had a routine appendectomy for a fraction of what they now owed for emergency surgery. Harper knew exactly how much that kind of specialized consultation cost, because she'd grown up hearing her father complain about patients who couldn't afford proper health care. Dr. Thornton had built his reputation and fortune treating wealthy patients who could pay premium fees for his expertise. He'd always justified his high charges by claiming that successful patients subsidized charity cases, but Harper had never seen evidence of such generosity. The irony was that Harper now had access to the very resources Dylan needed, her inheritance from her mother, carefully invested over the past decade, had grown substantially. She could pay Sophie's entire hospital bill without significantly impacting her own financial security. But Harper had learned from her mother's experience that good intentions could have complicated consequences, especially when they involved people who valued their independence and dignity. As Harper walked through the hospital corridors toward the pediatric wing, she thought about Dylan's obvious pride and his determination to handle his problems alone. She'd seen how he'd reacted to her small gestures, the good coffee, the crayons for Sophie, the extra time she spent in their room. He was grateful but uncomfortable, clearly not used to accepting help from others. Harper understood that feeling intimately. After her mother died, well-meaning friends and relatives had offered assistance that felt more like pity than genuine support. The college guidance counselor who'd suggested Harper might want to consider community college instead of a 4-year university, given her circumstances. The social worker who'd assumed Harper would need financial aid and emotional counseling to cope with being orphaned. The distant relatives who'd suddenly taken interest in her welfare once they learned about Catherine's life insurance policy. But Dylan was different. His discomfort with charity seemed to come from a desire to be the provider and protector Sophie needed, not from false pride or stubbornness. Harper had watched him interact with his daughter and seen genuine love, patience, and tenderness. Sophie clearly adored her father and felt secure in his care. Despite their financial struggles, the challenge was figuring out how to help without undermining Dylan's sense of competence as a parent. Harper had been thinking about the problem for 3 days, and she'd finally settled on an approach that might work. It would require careful planning and probably some rule bending. But Harper had learned from her mother that sometimes the most important work happened outside official channels. As she approached room 314, Harper could see Dylan through the partially open door. He was sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside Sophie's bed, holding what looked like a stack of medical bills. His shoulders were hunched with exhaustion, and even from a distance, Harper could see the stress etched into his features. Sophie was awake, drawing with the crayons Harper had provided yesterday. The little girl looked up as Harper entered the room, her face brightening with genuine happiness. "Harper, look what I made today." Sophie held up a new drawing, this one showing a nurse with dark hair helping a little girl walk down a hospital corridor. "It's you helping me get better." Harper felt her heart tighten at the simple sweetness of the gesture. This was why she'd become a nurse, for moments like this, when she could make a real difference in someone's life. But as she looked at Dylan's weary face and thought about the impossible financial burden hanging over this family, Harper realized that sometimes making a real difference required more than professional compassion. Sometimes it required taking risks. The collision of two very different worlds began with something as simple as a lost identification badge. Harper had been rushing to start her shift when she realized her hospital ID was missing from the lanyard around her neck. Without it, she couldn't access secured areas of the hospital or log into the computer systems needed to review patient charts. She retraced her steps through the parking garage, the lobby, and the staff break room, but the badge was nowhere to be found. Reluctantly, Harper made her way to the security office on the first floor, where Night Supervisor Kevin Shaw was known for his thorough but slow approach to handling lost ID issues. What should have been a 5-minute replacement process turned into 20 minutes of paperwork and verification procedures that left Harper running late for the first time in her 2 years at Westfield General. By the time she reached the pediatric wing, the evening shift change was already underway. Day shift nurses were giving reports to their night counterparts, and Harper could see that room 314 was being attended to by Michelle Torres, one of the more experienced nurses who often filled in during transition periods. "Sorry I'm late," Harper said, approaching Michelle near the nurses' station. "I had to replace my ID badge." Michelle looked up from the patient chart she was reviewing, her expression slightly puzzled. "Actually, Harper, there's been a change in assignments tonight. Janet Morrison from Billing has requested that all the Hayes family interactions go through the senior nursing staff. Something about sensitivity around their financial situation." Harper felt a chill of apprehension. Janet Morrison was the hospital's financial coordinator, the woman responsible for ensuring that payment arrangements were established for all patients. Harper had seen Janet's type before: professional, efficient, and completely focused on the bottom line of healthcare as a business rather than a service. "What kind of sensitivity?" Harper asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Michelle lowered her voice, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Apparently the family owes over $100,000, and Mr. Hayes has been difficult about payment arrangements. Janet thinks it's better if we maintain some professional distance until the financial issues are resolved." The implication was clear. The hospital administration was concerned that staff members might become too emotionally invested in patients who couldn't pay their bills. Harper had heard rumors about nurses who'd gotten involved in families' financial problems, sometimes even contributing their own money to help with medical expenses. From the hospital's perspective, such involvement created liability issues and set precedents they preferred to avoid. "I understand," Harper said, though every instinct rebelled against the directive. "Has anyone checked on Sophie tonight?" "She's been asking about when I'd be back. Dr. Martinez did evening rounds about an hour ago. The little girl is recovering well. She should be discharged tomorrow if her pain levels continue to improve." Michelle hesitated, then added, "Look, Harper, I know you've been spending extra time with the family. They're nice people, and it's A terrible situation, but getting too involved won't help anyone in the long run. Harper nodded and accepted the new patient assignments Michelle handed her, but her thoughts remained focused on room 314. She'd made a promise to Sophie about teaching her friendship bracelet braiding, and the 8-year-old had been looking forward to the lesson all day. More than that, Harper was worried about Dylan. She'd seen the stress building in him over the past 3 days, watched him struggle with decisions no parent should have to face. 2 hours into her shift, Harper was checking on an elderly patient with pneumonia when she heard raised voices coming from the direction of room 314. She quickly finished recording her patient's vital signs and hurried toward the commotion, arriving to find Dylan standing in the hallway outside Sophie's room, his face flushed with anger and frustration. Janet Morrison was there as well, flanked by Kevin Shaw from security and Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital's chief administrator. Janet held a clipboard thick with paperwork, and her expression suggested she'd been through this conversation many times before with other families. "Mr. Hayes," Janet was saying in her most professional tone, "I understand your position, but the hospital has policies that must be followed. We've already extended more courtesy than usual by allowing you to remain here for 3 days without establishing a payment plan." "I told you I need more time," Dylan replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "I'm trying to figure out how to make this work, but the payment amounts you're demanding are impossible." Dr. Williams stepped forward, her demeanor slightly more sympathetic than Janet's but equally firm. "Mr. Hayes, Sophie's medical care has been excellent and she's recovering beautifully. However, continued hospitalization is no longer medically necessary. We need to discharge her today so that other patients can access these resources." Harper could see Sophie through the partially open door, sitting up in bed with wide, frightened eyes. The 8-year-old was clearly listening to every word of the adult's conversation, and Harper's heart ached at the confusion and fear she could see on the little girl's face. "I'm not trying to avoid paying," Dylan said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "But what you're asking is literally impossible. I make less in a year than what you want me to pay in the first 6 months. There has to be another option." Janet consulted her clipboard with the air of someone who'd had this exact conversation dozens of times. "Mr. Hayes, we've already applied our maximum charity care discount. The payment plan I've offered represents the most flexibility our billing department can provide. If you're unable to commit to these terms, we'll have to pursue other collection methods." The threat hung in the air like a physical presence. Harper knew that other collection methods meant wage garnishment, liens against property, and potentially legal action that could follow Dylan for years. She also knew that none of these aggressive tactics would actually result in the hospital recovering the full amount owed. They were simply designed to pressure families into accepting payment arrangements that would cripple them financially. "What if I can't make the payments?" Dylan asked quietly. "What happens then?" "The hospital will take appropriate action to recover the debt," Dr. Williams replied. "That could include garnishing your wages, placing liens against any property you own, and reporting the debt to credit agencies. These are standard procedures for uncollected medical debt." Harper watched Dylan's face crumble slightly at this news. She knew he was probably calculating how long he could keep Sophie housed and fed if a significant portion of his paycheck was taken by wage garnishment. The answer was likely not long. "Can I have tonight to think about it?" Dylan asked. "Sophie's been through a lot, and I'd like to explain the situation to her privately before we leave." Janet looked like she wanted to refuse, but Dr. Williams nodded. "That's reasonable. We'll need your decision by tomorrow morning, and discharge procedures will begin regardless of your payment arrangement status." As the hospital administrators walked away, Harper found herself facing a moment that would change everything. She could follow protocol, maintain her professional distance, and let Dylan navigate this impossible situation alone. Or she could step forward and risk her job, her carefully maintained anonymity, and potentially her relationship with Sophie and Dylan by revealing who she really was. Dylan was still standing in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his eyes closed, when Harper approached him. "Mr. Hayes?" she said softly. "I couldn't help but overhear some of that conversation. Are you okay?" Dylan opened his eyes and looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "Harper, I'm sorry you had to witness that. I know the hospital has rules, and I'm not trying to cause problems for anyone." "You're not causing problems," Harper said firmly. "You're trying to care for your daughter in an impossible situation. That's what good parents do. Good parents don't end up owing more money than they'll make in the next 5 years, Dylan replied bitterly. Good parents have insurance that covers their kids' medical needs, and savings accounts for emergencies, and backup plans for when everything goes wrong. Harper felt something crack open inside her chest. "Mr. Hayes Dullen, can I tell you something my mother used to say?" Dylan nodded, looking slightly surprised by her use of his first name. "She used to say that being a good parent had nothing to do with how much money you had in the bank. It was about showing up day after day, even when everything felt impossible, especially then." Harper paused, gathering courage for what she was about to do. "Dylan, what if I told you there might be another option? Something the billing department doesn't know about?" Dylan straightened, hope and wariness warring in his expression. "What kind of option?" Harper glanced around to make sure they were alone, then moved closer and lowered her voice. "There are resources available for families in situations like yours. Private foundations, charitable organizations, individuals who prefer to help anonymously. Sometimes these resources can cover medical expenses entirely." "I don't understand," Dylan said slowly. "Janet Morrison said they'd already applied the maximum charity care discount." "Official charity care is one thing," Harper replied carefully. "But there are other ways to help families, ways that don't go through hospital administration. It would require some discretion on your part." Dylan studied her face intently, and Harper could see him trying to figure out what she was really saying. "Harper, who are you? I mean, I know you're a nurse, but there's something else, isn't there? The way you talk about these resources, the coffee from the executive break room, the way you seem to know things about hospital policies that regular staff wouldn't know." Harper felt her carefully constructed professional facade beginning to crumble. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she hadn't expected it to happen so quickly or under such intense circumstances. "Dylan," she said finally, "if I tell you something that could change everything for you, for Sophie, for all of us, do you promise to hear me out completely before you make any decisions?" The question hung between them in the sterile hospital hallway, loaded with implications that neither of them fully understood yet. Dylan looked through the doorway at Sophie, who was pretending to color but was clearly listening to every word. "Yes," he said simply, "I promise." And with that single word, Harper stepped across a line she'd spent 2 years avoiding, setting in motion events that would transform all their lives in ways none of them could predict. The conversation that changed everything began in the hospital's family consultation room, a small space designed to provide privacy for difficult discussions between medical staff and patients' families. Harper had suggested they move there. After Dylan agreed to hear her out, partly for privacy, but mostly because she needed a few minutes to figure out exactly how to explain something she'd never spoken about to anyone. Sophie had been reluctant to let her father leave, even for a few minutes, but Harper had promised to return soon with a special surprise, the friendship bracelet supplies she'd mentioned days earlier. The little girl had accepted this compromise, with the trust that only children could show, making Harper even more aware of the responsibility she was about to take on. The consultation room was painted in soothing pastels and furnished with comfortable chairs arranged around a small round table. Harper had been in this room many times with other families, usually for conversations about end-of-life care or treatment options for terminal illnesses. She'd never expected to use it for revealing secrets that could fundamentally alter her relationship with the patient and his father. Dylan sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, clearly exhausted from 3 days of stress and uncertainty. Harper could see the construction worker's calluses on his fingers, the evidence of years spent building things with his hands. There was something reassuring about those hands. They spoke of competence, reliability, and honest work. They also spoke of a man who was used to solving problems through effort and determination, qualities that made Harper's planned revelation both easier and more complicated. "Dylan," Harper began, then stopped, realizing she'd never actually said his name aloud before this evening. "I need to tell you something about myself, about why I'm in a position to help you in ways that might seem unusual for a nurse." "Okay," Dylan said simply, his tone encouraging her to continue. Harper took a deep breath and decided to start with the least complicated part of the truth. 2 years ago, when I took this job at Westfield General, I wasn't entirely honest about my qualifications or my background. I have a nursing degree from the state university, and I'm fully licensed and competent to do my job. But I also have resources that most people in my position don't have. Dylan's expression remained neutral, waiting for her to explain. "My mother died when I was 25, Harper continued. She'd been sick for several years with rheumatoid arthritis, and toward the end, she required extensive medical care. The treatments were expensive, and she worried constantly about the financial burden of her illness. She died here, at Westfield General, owing the hospital nearly $40,000. "I'm sorry," Dylan said quietly. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "It was. But here's the thing, my mother had life insurance that I inherited, along with some investments she'd made over the years. Not a fortune, but enough that I could live comfortably without working, or travel, or do whatever I wanted. Instead, I chose to become a nurse and work at the hospital where my mother died owing money she couldn't pay." Dylan was beginning to look puzzled, clearly trying to understand where the story was leading. Harper continued, "What I'm trying to say is that I have the resources to help families like yours, and I've been looking for the right opportunity to do something meaningful with that money. Something my mother would have approved of." "Harper," Dylan said carefully, "are you offering to loan me money? Because I have to be honest, I don't know when or even if I'd be able to pay back a loan of that size." "Not a loan," Harper replied. "A gift. Anonymous, if you prefer, channeled through a charitable foundation that specializes in helping families with medical debt. It would cover Sophie's entire bill and set up a fund for any future medical expenses she might need." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute as Dylan processed what Harper had just offered. She watched a succession of emotions cross his face: disbelief, hope, confusion, and finally something that looked like suspicion. "Harper, we barely know each other," he said finally. "You've been Sophie's nurse for 3 days. Why would you give that kind of money to strangers?" It was a fair question, and Harper had been preparing for it since she'd first considered making this offer. "You're not strangers, not anymore. In 3 days, I've watched you prioritize Sophie's needs above everything else, including your own comfort and sleep. I've seen how much she loves and trusts you, and how hard you've worked to keep her feeling safe and secure, even when you're terrified about the future. That's the kind of parent my mother was, and the kind of person she would have wanted me to help." Dylan shook his head slowly. "Harper, this is incredibly generous, but I can't accept charity of that magnitude. It would change everything between us, and more importantly, it would teach Sophie that someone else will always come along to solve our problems." Harper had expected this response. It was exactly what she would have said in Dylan's position. What if it wasn't charity? What if it was an investment in something larger than Sophie's medical bills? "I don't understand." Harper leaned forward, choosing her words carefully. "I've been thinking about my mother's experience as a patient here, and your experience as Sophie's father. and all the other families I've seen struggle with medical debt over the past 2 years. The system is broken. Dylan, families shouldn't have to choose between their children's health and their financial survival. Agreed, but I'm not sure how that changes our immediate situation. What if we could document Sophie's case, your experience, as a family navigating this system, and use it to advocate for policy changes? Medical debt relief, insurance reform, hospital billing practices. There are organizations working on these issues that could benefit from real stories about real families. Dylan looked intrigued but still skeptical. You're talking about publicity, interviews, making our situation public? Only if you're comfortable with that, and only in ways that could help other families. Think about it, you're an experienced construction worker who lost everything because of a workplace accident and medical bills. Sophie is a bright, resilient kid who nearly died because you couldn't afford proper diagnostic care earlier. Your story could help change things for other people. And in exchange, you'd pay Sophie's hospital bill? I'd pay the bill regardless, Harper said firmly. What I'm offering is a way for you to feel like partners in something important, rather than charity recipients. We could work together to help other families avoid what you've been through. Dylan was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the implications of Harper's proposal. Finally he asked, "Why is this so important to you? And please don't tell me it's just about honoring your mother's memory. There's something else, isn't there?" Harper felt her heart rate accelerate. This was the moment she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "Dylan, there's something else I need to tell you about myself, about why I work at this particular hospital. Okay, my last name isn't actually Lane. I changed it legally when I turned 18. My birth name was Harper Thornton." Dylan's face went blank for a moment, then understanding began to dawn. Thornton, as in ... Dr. William Thornton. The man whose name is on the lobby plaque, the owner of this hospital. Harper's voice was steady, but her hands were trembling slightly. "My father." The silence that followed was profound. Dylan stared at her as if she'd revealed herself to be an entirely different person, which in some ways, Harper supposed, she had. "Your father owns this hospital," Dylan said slowly. "The hospital that's demanding over $100,000 from me, and you're offering to pay that bill with your inheritance money. Yes. Does he know you work here?" "No. We haven't spoken in over 10 years, not since my mother died. He doesn't know I changed my name, doesn't know where I live or what I do for work." Dylan rubbed his forehead, clearly trying to process this information. "Harper, I don't even know what this is. You're the owner's daughter, but you're working as a staff nurse under a false name, and now you want to pay my bill anonymously? I know it sounds complicated." "Complicated?" Dylan's voice rose slightly. Then he caught himself and glanced toward the door, mindful that they were still in a hospital. "Harper, this is insane. What happens when your father finds out? What happens to your job, your career?" "I don't know," Harper admitted. "I've been asking myself those same questions for 3 days. But I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Some things are more important than job security or family relationships that were already broken. And what if I say no? What if I decide this is too complicated and I just want to work out a payment plan with the billing department?" Harper felt a stab of panic at the thought, but she tried to keep her voice calm. "Then I'll respect your decision and continue being Sophie's nurse for as long as she's here. Nothing has to change between us unless you want it to." Dylan stood up and walked to the small window that looked out over the hospital's parking lot. Harper could see his reflection in the glass, his expression thoughtful and troubled. "Sophie really likes you," he said finally. "I really like her too. She's an amazing kid, Dylan. You should be proud of the job you've done raising her, even though I can't afford to pay for her medical care. Especially because you've prioritized her well-being over everything else, including your own pride. That's what love looks like. Dylan turned back to face her. If I agree to this, and I'm not saying I am, what would it actually look like? How would the money get paid? And how would we work together on advocacy or policy changes? Harper felt a flutter of hope. I have a lawyer who handles my financial affairs. She could set up a charitable foundation that would pay the hospital directly. As far as Westfield General would know, an anonymous donor saw Sophie's case and decided to help. It happens more often than you might think. And the advocacy work? There are several organizations working on medical debt relief and healthcare reform. We could start by connecting with them, sharing your story if you're comfortable maybe. Participating in research studies or policy discussions. Nothing that would interfere with your work or Sophie's school. Just ways to help other families. Dylan was quiet for another long moment. Harper, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why haven't you spoken to your father in 10 years? I mean, I understand that he wasn't there when your mother died, but 10 years is a long time. To hold a grudge. Harper had known this question would come up eventually, but she still wasn't prepared for how much it hurt to think about. It's not about holding a grudge. It's about accepting that some people are incapable of putting other people's needs before their own ambitions. My father chose his career over his family repeatedly for my entire childhood. My mother's death was just the final example of a pattern that had been going on for years. But he's still your father. Biologically, yes. But being a father requires more than contributing DNA. It requires showing up, being present, making sacrifices when necessary. Dylan, you've been more of a father to Sophie in the 3 days I've known you than William Thornton was to me in 18 years. Dylan looked surprised by the comparison. Harper, I'm not exactly father of the year material. I'm broke. I live in a tiny apartment, and I can't even afford my daughter's medical bills. And yet Sophie feels completely safe and loved. She draws pictures of you as a superhero. She worries about whether you're eating enough and getting enough sleep. That's not because you can provide her with material things. It's because you've shown her every single day that she's the most important thing in your world. Tears welled up in Dylan's eyes, and Harper realized she'd touched something deep and painful. I just want to give her everything she deserves, he said quietly. You already are, Harper replied. Everything else is just details. When Dylan finally looked up at her, Harper saw that something had shifted in his expression. The wariness was still there, but it was mixed with something that looked like trust. If we do this, he said slowly, if we become partners in whatever this advocacy work turns out to be, I need to know that you're doing it for the right reasons. Not because you feel sorry for us, and not because you're trying to rebel against your father. I'm doing it because Sophie deserves a future that isn't defined by medical debt, and because other kids deserve the same thing, and because working with you and Sophie feels like the most meaningful thing I've done since my mother died. Dylan nodded slowly. Okay, let's do it, but I have one condition. What's that? At some point, when the timing is right, I want to meet your father. I want to understand what kind of man walks away from a daughter like you. Harper felt her stomach drop. Dylan, that's not a good idea. He doesn't even know I work here, and confronting him could jeopardize everything. I'm not talking about confronting him. I'm talking about understanding him. If we're going to be partners, I need to know all the players in this situation, including the ones who might become problems later. It was a reasonable request, but it terrified Harper more than anything else they'd discussed. Still, Dylan was right. If they were going to move forward together, he deserved to know what they might be dealing with. Okay, she said finally, but let's get Sophie's bill resolved first. Everything else can wait until we know she's safe. And you don't have to worry about the financial pressure. Dylan extended his hand across the small table. Partners? Partners? Harper shook his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of honest work and the strength that had carried his family through impossible circumstances. Partners, she agreed, and for the first time in years, Harper felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 3 weeks after Sophie's discharge from Westfield General, Dylan's small apartment in Riverside Gardens had been transformed into something that felt remarkably like a home. The sterile, institutional feeling that had dominated their lives during the hospital stay had been replaced by warmth, laughter, and the comfortable chaos that comes from people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. Harper had become a regular presence in their lives, arriving most evenings after her hospital shift with takeout from local restaurants and art supplies for Sophie's ever-growing collection of projects. What had begun as checkups on Sophie's recovery had evolved into something none of them had expected. A found family that filled gaps they hadn't even realized existed. The financial crisis that had threatened to destroy their future had been resolved with the quiet efficiency Harper had promised. Her lawyer, Amelia Ross, had established the Catherine Lane Memorial Foundation, named after Harper's mother, and within a week, Westfield General's billing department had received a check for the full amount of Sophie's medical expenses. Dylan had watched Janet Morrison's expression shift from skeptical to amazed when she'd called to inform him that an anonymous donor had paid his entire debt. "This is highly unusual, Mr. Hayes," Janet had said during their phone conversation. "Anonymous donors typically contribute to general hospital funds, not specific patient accounts. You must have made quite an impression on someone." Dylan had simply accepted the news with appropriate gratitude, not mentioning that he now understood exactly who had been impressed and why. The relief of no longer facing financial ruin had lifted a weight from his shoulders that he'd been carrying. For so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. But the real transformation in their lives had nothing to do with money. Sophie, who had always been mature beyond her years due to their circumstances, had begun acting like the 8-year-old she actually was. She giggled during Harper's attempts to cook dinner, taught her new card games she'd learned at school, and created elaborate art projects that covered every available surface in their small living room. Harper, meanwhile, had rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried since her mother's death. Dylan watched her laugh at Sophie's silly jokes, patiently help with homework assignments about fractions and spelling words, and listen with genuine interest to detailed explanations of playground politics and classroom drama. The professional reserve that Harper maintained at the hospital melted away completely in their apartment, revealing someone who was naturally nurturing and surprisingly playful. The three of them had developed routines that felt as natural as breathing. Harper would arrive around 8 o'clock each evening, usually with dinner from whatever restaurant had caught her attention during her drive from the hospital. They'd eat together at Dylan's small kitchen table while Sophie regaled them with stories from her day at school. After dinner, Harper would help Sophie with any homework while Dylan cleaned up. Then they'd settle on the couch for whatever movie or television show Sophie had chosen. Dylan found himself looking forward to these evenings with an intensity that surprised him. After years of feeling like he was constantly struggling to keep his head above water, he finally had something to look forward to each day. Harper's presence brought stability and joy to their lives, but more than that, she brought perspective. That helped Dylan see their situation differently. "You know," Harper had said one evening as they watched Sophie carefully arrange her art supplies for a new project, "she's remarkably well adjusted for a kid who's been through so much uncertainty." "She's had to be," Dylan replied, then realized how that sounded. "I mean, I've tried to keep things stable for her, but there have been a lot of changes over the years." "That's exactly my point," Harper said, turning to face him on the couch. "She feels secure because you've been her constant. Moving apartments, changing schools, financial stress, none of that matters to her because she knows you'll always be there." It was the kind of reassurance Dylan hadn't realized he desperately needed to hear. For years, he'd measured his success as a parent by external standards, their live-in situation, his income, the opportunities he could provide for Sophie. Harper helped him understand that Sophie's happiness and security came from something much more fundamental: the unwavering love and presence he'd provided every single day. The partnership they'd discussed in the hospital consultation room had also begun to take shape. Harper had connected Dylan with Healthcare Justice Coalition, a nonprofit organization working on medical debt reform and patient advocacy. Dylan had participated in 2 phone interviews for research studies about the impact of medical debt on working families, sharing his story with policy researchers who were documenting the need for systemic changes. "Your case is particularly compelling," Dr. Patricia Williams from the coalition had told Dylan during their second interview. "You represent exactly the kind of family that current healthcare financing fails: employed, insured, responsible, but still completely vulnerable to catastrophic medical expenses." The work felt meaningful in ways Dylan hadn't expected. Instead of being just another casualty of a broken system, he was becoming part of the solution. Harper had been right about the value of turning their experience into advocacy. It gave purpose to their suffering and hope that other families might avoid similar crises, but the most significant change in their lives was harder to define. Somewhere between the takeout dinners and homework help sessions, between Sophie's art projects and Dylan's advocacy interviews, the 3 of them had become something that looked remarkably like a family. Not the traditional nuclear family that Dylan had once imagined for himself and Sophie, but something uniquely their own that worked beautifully. Sophie had begun referring to Harper as "my hospital angel who stayed," a description that made both adults laugh and tear up simultaneously. The little girl's artwork now regularly featured 3 figures holding hands in front of various backgrounds: their apartment, the local park, the pizza place where they'd celebrated Sophie's successful 2-week post-surgery checkup. Dylan found himself falling asleep each night with a sense of contentment he hadn't experienced since before Rebecca's death. For the first time in years, their future felt bright and full of possibilities rather than threats and uncertainties. The unraveling began with something as innocent as Sophie's school registration forms. Dylan had been updating her emergency contact information when he noticed a new field on the district's online portal: Alternative Guardian Authorization. Curious, he clicked on the section and discovered that someone had already filled out the paperwork, listing Harper Lane as an authorized guardian with permission to make medical and educational decisions for Sophie in Dylan's absence. Dylan stared at the computer screen in his kitchen, feeling something cold and unpleasant settle in his stomach. He'd never discussed emergency guardianship with Harper, had never even mentioned the school's requirements for alternative contacts. Yet somehow, the paperwork had been completed with Harper's personal information, contact details, and even a notarized signature. His hands trembling slightly, Dylan dug deeper into the school district's online records. What he found made his blood run cold. Harper wasn't listed as just an emergency contact. She was designated as Sophie's legal guardian in the event of Dylan's incapacity, with full authority to make decisions about medical care, education, and living arrangements. The authorization had been filed 2 weeks ago, during the time when Dylan thought they were building a partnership based on trust and mutual respect. "Sophie," Dylan called to his daughter, who was working on homework at the kitchen table. "Did Harper ever ask you to sign any papers at school? Maybe something about emergency contacts or permission slips?" Sophie looked up from her math worksheet, her expression innocent but slightly guilty. "Oh yeah. Harper said it was important for grown-ups to have backup plans, especially for kids like me who might need special medical attention," she said. "It was like having a safety net." "When did this happen?" "Last week, when she picked me up from school because you had that job interview. She said she needed to update some forms with the office so they'd know she was allowed to help take care of me." Dylan felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. The job interview Sophie was referring to had been for a supervisory position with a construction company in Springfield, an opportunity that could have significantly improved their financial situation. Harper had volunteered to pick Sophie up from school that day, presenting it as a simple favor between friends. Dylan had been grateful for the help and hadn't thought to question what else might have happened during that school visit. Now he realized that Harper had used his absence to establish legal authority over his daughter without his knowledge or consent. Worse, she'd involved Sophie in the deception, teaching an 8-year-old to keep secrets from her father about something as fundamental as guardianship arrangements. Dylan spent the next hour researching guardianship laws online, discovering that the forms Harper had filed gave her significant legal rights regarding Sophie's welfare. While Dylan retained primary custody, Harper could now make emergency medical decisions, authorize educational services, and even petition for temporary custody if she believed Sophie was in danger or being neglected. The implications were staggering. Harper, who had presented herself as a partner and friend, had quietly positioned herself to take control of Sophie's life if she deemed it necessary. Dylan couldn't help but wonder if this had been her plan all along: pay off their medical debt to establish her value to the family, then gradually assume legal authority over Sophie under the guise of providing safety nets. When Harper arrived that evening with Chinese takeout and her usual cheerful greeting, Dylan was waiting in the kitchen with the guardianship paperwork printed out and spread across the table. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled anger. Harper took one look at the papers and immediately understood what had happened. Her face went pale, and she set down the bags of food with shaking hands. "Dylan, I can explain. Can you? Because what this looks like is that you've been systematically positioning yourself to take legal control of my daughter while pretending to be our friend." "That's not what this is," Harper protested, moving closer to the table. "I was trying to protect Sophie. You're a single parent with a physically demanding job. What happens if you get hurt at work or if there's another medical emergency? Who makes decisions for Sophie if you can't?" "I make those decisions," Dylan said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "I'm her father. Not you, not anyone else, me." Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, clearly drawn by the sound of raised voices. "Daddy? Harper? Why are you yelling?" Dylan's heart broke at the confusion and fear in his daughter's voice. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid: Sophie being caught in the middle of adult conflicts and disappointments. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Dylan said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Harper and I just need to discuss some grown-up things. Why don't you finish your homework in your room? But I want to show Harper my spelling test. I got all the words right. Later, bug. We'll celebrate later." After Sophie reluctantly retreated to her room, Dylan turned back to Harper with barely contained fury. "How could you involve her in this? How could you teach my daughter to keep secrets from me about something this important?" "I wasn't trying to create secrets," Harper said, tears beginning to well in her eyes. "I was trying to create security. Dylan, what if something happens to you? What if you're in an accident or you get sick or—" "Then Sophie has family," Dylan interrupted. "My sister in Oregon, Rebecca's parents in Florida. She has people who love her and would take care of her. Family who live across the country and barely know her current circumstances," Harper pointed out. "Family who would have to uproot her entire life, take her away from her school, her friends, everything familiar. That would be my decision to make, not yours. Even if it wasn't the best decision for Sophie?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Dylan's anger even sharper. "Are you suggesting that I don't know what's best for my own daughter?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes people who love someone can make decisions based on emotion rather than logic," Harper replied. "I've seen it happen countless times at the hospital: families who choose treatments based on hope rather than medical reality. Parents who prioritize their own need to feel useful over their children's actual needs. So you decided to circumvent my parental authority entirely." You decided that you know better than I do what Sophie needs. I decided to make sure she had options, Harper said, her voice growing stronger. I decided to create a backup plan that would keep her life stable. If anything happened to you, Dylan laughed bitterly. And it's just a coincidence that this backup plan puts you in charge? It's just a coincidence that the anonymous donor who paid our medical bills also happens to be the person who's now legally authorized to make decisions about Sophie's future? Harper flinched as if he'd slapped her. Dylan, you're making this sound like some kind of elaborate scheme. I paid your medical bills because I wanted to help, not because I wanted to control your family. Did you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you used our desperation to buy your way into Sophie's life, and now you're using legal maneuvers to make sure you can't be removed from it. That's not fair, Harper said, tears now flowing freely. You know that's not who I am. Do I? Because the Harper I thought I knew would never make major decisions about my daughter behind my back. The Harper I thought I knew understood that being a good friend meant respecting boundaries, not secretly expanding her authority over my family. Dylan gathered up the guardianship paperwork and held it out to Harper. I want this rescinded. All of it. Tomorrow. Dylan, please, just think about this logically. What's the harm in having a backup plan? What's the harm in making sure Sophie has someone local who knows her medical history, her preferences, her routines? The harm is that it's not your decision to make. Dylan's voice finally broke through his controlled restraint. The harm is that you've just proven I can't trust you with the most important thing in my life. Harper stared at him for a long moment, hurt and confusion warring in her expression. So what are you saying? That you want me out of your lives completely? Dylan felt something break inside his chest at the question, but his anger was stronger than his pain. I'm saying that I need to protect Sophie from people who think they know better than her father what's good for her. Even if those people have good intentions, even if those people love her? Harper whispered, especially then, Dylan replied. Because love without respect for boundaries isn't love at all, it's possession. Harper picked up her purse and walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. I hope you're right, Dylan. I hope you never need a backup plan. Never face an emergency where having someone local who loves Sophie could make the difference between her thriving and her suffering. I hope so too, Dylan said quietly. But if that day comes, it'll be my choice who steps up to help. Not yours. After Harper left, Dylan sat alone in his kitchen, surrounded by cooling Chinese food and the fragments of what had felt like a perfect new beginning. From her room, he could hear Sophie quietly crying, undoubtedly confused by the sudden tension and Harper's abrupt departure. For the first time in weeks, Dylan felt completely alone again. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jolting Dylan awake from the first deep sleep he'd managed in the 3 weeks since Harper had stopped coming to their apartment. Sophie was getting ready for school in the bathroom, and Dylan was trying to force himself out of bed for another day of pretending everything was fine when his phone rang with an unknown number. Mr. Hayes? This is Kathy Thorne from the Department of Children and Family Services. I need to schedule a home visit to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding your daughter's welfare. Dylan spent the next hour researching guardianship laws online, discovering that the forms Harper had filed gave her significant legal rights regarding Sophie's welfare. While Dylan retained primary custody, Harper could now make emergency medical decisions, authorize educational services, and even petition for temporary custody if she believed Sophie was in danger or being neglected. The implications were staggering. Harper, who had presented herself as a partner and friend, had quietly positioned herself to take control of Sophie's life if she deemed it necessary. Dylan couldn't help but wonder if this had been her plan all along: pay off their medical debt to establish her value to the family, then gradually assume legal authority over Sophie under the guise of providing safety nets. When Harper arrived that evening with Chinese takeout and her usual cheerful greeting, Dylan was waiting in the kitchen with the guardianship paperwork printed out and spread across the table. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled anger. Harper took one look at the papers and immediately understood what had happened. Her face went pale, and she set down the bags of food with shaking hands. "Dylan, I can explain. Can you? Because what this looks like is that you've been systematically positioning yourself to take legal control of my daughter while pretending to be our friend." "That's not what this is," Harper protested, moving closer to the table. "I was trying to protect Sophie. You're a single parent with a physically demanding job. What happens if you get hurt at work, or if there's another medical emergency? Who makes decisions for Sophie if you can't?" "I make those decisions," Dylan said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "I'm her father. Not you, not anyone else, me." Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, clearly drawn by the sound of raised voices. "Daddy? Harper? Why are you yelling?" Dylan's heart broke at the confusion and fear in his daughter's voice. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid: Sophie being caught in the middle of adult conflicts and disappointments. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Dylan said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Harper and I just need to discuss some grown-up things. Why don't you finish your homework in your room?" "Your room. But I want to show Harper my spelling test. I got all the words right. Later, bug, we'll celebrate later." After Sophie reluctantly retreated to her room, Dylan turned back to Harper with barely contained fury. "How could you involve her in this? How could you teach my daughter to keep secrets from me about something this important?" "I wasn't trying to create secrets," Harper said, tears beginning to well in her eyes. "I was trying to create security. Dylan, what if something happens to you? What if you're in an accident, or you get sick, or—" "Then Sophie has family," Dylan interrupted. "My sister in Oregon, Rebecca's parents in Florida. She has people who love her and would take care of her. Family who live across the country and barely know her current circumstances," Harper pointed out. "Family who would have to uproot her entire life, take her away from her school, her friends, everything familiar. That would be my decision to make, not yours. Even if it wasn't the best decision for Sophie." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Dylan's anger even sharper. "Are you suggesting that I don't know what's best for my own daughter?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes people who love someone can make decisions based on emotion rather than logic," Harper replied. "I've seen it happen countless times at the hospital. Families who choose treatments based on hope rather than medical reality. Parents who prioritize their own need to feel useful over their children's actual needs. So you decided to circumvent my parental authority entirely. You decided that you know better than I do what Sophie needs." "I decided to make sure she had options," Harper said, her voice growing stronger. "I decided to create a backup plan that would keep her life stable. If anything happened to you," Dylan laughed bitterly, "and it's just a coincidence that this backup plan puts you in charge? It's just a coincidence that the anonymous donor who paid our medical bills also happens to be the person who's now legally authorized to make decisions about Sophie's future?" Harper flinched as if he'd slapped her. "Dylan, you're making this sound like some kind of elaborate scheme. I paid your medical bills because I wanted to help, not because I wanted to control your family. Did you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you used our desperation to buy your way into Sophie's life, and now you're using legal maneuvers to make sure you can't be removed from it." "That's not fair," Harper said, tears now flowing freely. "You know that's not who I am." "Do I? Because the Harper I thought I knew would never make major decisions about my daughter behind my back. The Harper I thought I knew understood that being a good friend meant respecting boundaries, not secretly expanding her authority over my family." Dylan gathered up the guardianship paperwork and held it out to Harper. "I want this rescinded. All of it, tomorrow. Dylan, please, just think about this logically. What's the harm in having a backup plan? What's the harm in making sure Sophie has someone local who knows her medical history, her preferences, her routines? The harm is that it's not your decision to make. Dylan's voice finally broke through his controlled restraint. The harm is that you've just proven I can't trust you with the most important thing in my life. Harper stared at him for a long moment, hurt and confusion warring in her expression. So what are you saying? That you want me out of your lives completely? Dylan felt something break inside his chest at the question, but his anger was stronger than his pain. I'm saying that I need to protect Sophie from people who think they know better than her father what's good for her. Even if those people have good intentions, even if those people love her? Harper whispered. Especially then, Dylan replied. Because love without respect for boundaries isn't love at all, it's possession. Harper picked up her purse and walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. I hope you're right, Dylan. I hope you never need a backup plan. Never face an emergency where having someone local who loves Sophie could make the difference between her thriving and her suffering. I hope so too, Dylan said quietly. But if that day comes, it'll be my choice who steps up to help, not yours. After Harper left, Dylan sat alone in his kitchen, surrounded by cooling Chinese food and the fragments of what had felt like a perfect new beginning. From her room, he could hear Sophie quietly crying, undoubtedly confused by the sudden tension and Harper's abrupt departure. For the first time in weeks, Dylan felt completely alone again. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jolting Dylan awake from the first deep sleep he'd managed in the 3 weeks since Harper had stopped coming to their apartment. Sophie was getting ready for school in the bathroom, and Dylan was trying to force himself out of bed for another day of pretending everything was fine, when his phone rang with an unknown number. Mr. Hayes? This is Kathy Thorne from the Department of Children and Family Services. I need to schedule a home visit to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding your daughter's welfare. Dylan sat bolt upright, instantly wide awake. I'm sorry, what? What concerns? We've received a report suggesting that Sophie may be in an unsafe living situation, and that you may be struggling with substance abuse and financial instability. I'd like to come by this afternoon to conduct a welfare check and interview both you and Sophie. There's been some kind of mistake, Dylan said, his voice tight with panic. Sophie is perfectly safe. I don't use drugs or alcohol, and our financial situation is stable. Who filed this report? I'm not at liberty to discuss the source of the report. Mr. Hayes, what I can tell you is that the allegations are serious enough to warrant immediate investigation. Can you be available at 2 o'clock this afternoon? Dylan's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. Of course. Yes, we'll be here. But Miss Thorne, I need you to know that these allegations are completely false. Sophie is healthy, happy, and well cared for. I'm sure we'll get everything sorted out during our visit. Kathy replied with the professional neutrality that Dylan was beginning to recognize as bureaucratic code for "you're probably guilty until proven innocent." After ending the call, Dylan sat on the edge of his bed trying to figure out who could have reported him to Child Protective Services and why. His relationship with Harper had ended badly, but surely she wouldn't have called CPS out of spite. Besides, Harper had seen firsthand how much he loved Sophie and how well he cared for her. Rebecca was a possibility, though Dylan couldn't imagine why his ex-wife would suddenly take interest in Sophie's welfare after years of minimal contact. Rebecca sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, but she'd made it clear that hands-on parenting wasn't something she was interested in pursuing. Dylan's thoughts were interrupted by Sophie calling from the bathroom. Daddy, I can't find my favorite hair ribbon, the blue one with the sparkles. Check your backpack, Bug. Sometimes your ribbons end up in there with your art supplies. As Dylan helped Sophie search for the missing ribbon, he tried to maintain his normal morning routine, while internally panicking about the upcoming CPS visit. He'd heard horror stories about Child Protective Services removing children from loving homes based on false reports or misunderstandings. The thought of Sophie being taken from him, even temporarily, made Dylan feel physically sick. During the drive to Sophie's school, Dylan found himself studying his daughter's appearance and behavior with the critical eye of someone who knew they'd be evaluated. Sophie was clean, well-dressed, cheerful, and clearly well-nourished. She chattered about her upcoming book report and a field trip her class was planning to the Science Museum. Nothing about her suggested neglect or abuse, but Dylan also knew that CPS workers were trained to look for subtle signs of trouble changes in behavior, inappropriate knowledge about adult subjects, fear of going home. Would Sophie's recent sadness about Harper's absence be interpreted as evidence of family instability? Would her maturity beyond her years be seen as a sign that she'd been forced to take on adult responsibilities inappropriately? After dropping Sophie at school, Dylan called in sick to work and spent the morning frantically cleaning their already tidy apartment and gathering documentation that proved his fitness as a parent. Pay stubs showing steady employment, Sophie's school records demonstrating good attendance and academic performance, medical records from her recent hospital stay and follow-up appointments. He also called Healthcare Justice Coalition, the advocacy organization Harper had connected him with, hoping they might have experience dealing with CPS investigations related to medical debt cases. Unfortunately, this isn't uncommon. Dr. Patricia Williams explained during their phone conversation. Families who've experienced medical crises are sometimes reported to Child Protective Services by well-meaning individuals who assume that financial stress automatically indicates neglect. It's also possible that someone reported you maliciously, using the system to harass you for unrelated reasons. What should I expect during the home visit? The caseworker will interview both you and Sophie separately. They'll inspect your living space, ask about your employment and financial situation, and look for any evidence of substance abuse or domestic violence. As long as Sophie appears healthy and happy, and your home is clean and safe, you should be fine. Be fine. And if they decide to remove Sophie temporarily, that would only happen if they found evidence of immediate danger to her safety. Based on what you've told me about your situation, that seems extremely unlikely. Dylan felt somewhat reassured by Dr. Williams' confidence, but he still spent the rest of the morning worrying about worst-case scenarios. At 1:45 p.m., he was waiting by the window when a county vehicle pulled into the parking lot of his apartment complex. Kathy Thorne turned out to be a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Dylan of his elementary school principal. She was accompanied by Officer Julian Reed from the local police department, which immediately put Dylan on edge. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for accommodating this visit on short notice," Kathy said as Dylan let them into his apartment. "This is Officer Reed. He's here as a precaution, not because we expect any problems." Dylan nodded, though the presence of a police officer made him feel like he was already being treated as a criminal. "Can I ask what specific allegations have been made against me?" Kathy consulted her tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed report. "The complaint alleges that you've been leaving Sophie unsupervised for extended periods, that you've been drinking heavily, and that you're unable to provide adequate food, clothing, or medical care. There are also concerns about your mental health and stability following recent financial difficulties." Every allegation was not only false, but specifically crafted to sound plausible given Dylan's circumstances as a single father who'd recently faced medical debt. Someone had clearly put thought into making the accusations credible enough to trigger an investigation. "Miss Thorne, I need you to know that every single one of those allegations is false," Dylan said, trying to keep his voice calm and professional. "Sophie has never been left unsupervised inappropriately. I don't drink alcohol at all, haven't had a drink in over 2 years. Our recent medical bills were paid in full by a charitable foundation, so there are no financial pressures affecting our living situation. I appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Hayes. We'll need to verify all of that information, of course. Can I see Sophie's room and the rest of your living space? Dillon gave them a tour of the small apartment, pointing out Sophie's art projects on the refrigerator, her neatly organized bedroom, and the well-stocked kitchen. Officer Reed took notes while Kathy asked questions about their daily routines, Sophie's school attendance, and Dillon's work schedule. You mentioned that a charitable foundation paid your medical bills, Kathy said as they concluded the apartment tour. Can you provide documentation of that? Dillon handed her copies of the correspondence from Westfield General confirming that Sophie's account had been paid in full. He watched Kathy's expression change as she reviewed the paperwork. The amount was substantial enough to represent serious money, and the foundation's name carried weight in philanthropic circles. This is quite generous, Kathy observed. How did you come to the attention of the Catherine Lane Memorial Foundation? Through my advocacy work with Healthcare Justice Coalition, Dillon replied carefully. I've been participating in research studies about medical debt relief, and someone connected to the foundation learned about our situation. It wasn't technically a lie, though it certainly wasn't the complete truth. Dillon had decided that revealing Harper's identity and their personal relationship would only complicate an already difficult situation. Officer Reed's radio crackled with a call about a domestic disturbance across town, and he stepped onto the apartment's small balcony to respond. While he was outside, Kathy moved closer to Dillon and lowered her voice. Mr. Hayes, I have to ask, do you have any idea who might have filed this report? The allegations are quite specific, suggesting that whoever made them has detailed knowledge of your living situation and recent circumstances. Dillon had been dreading this question because he honestly didn't know the answer. I can't think of anyone who would want to cause problems for Sophie and me. We keep to ourselves pretty much, and I haven't had any conflicts with neighbors or co-workers. What about Sophie's mother? Any custody disputes or ongoing disagreements? Rebecca and I divorced years ago, and she's had minimal contact with Sophie since then. I can't imagine her suddenly filing a CPS report, especially since she's never expressed interest in having more custody or involvement. Kathy made additional notes on her tablet, then looked up at Dillon with an expression that seemed slightly more sympathetic than when she'd arrived. Mr. Hayes, I have to tell you that this complaint has some red flags that suggest it might not be entirely legitimate. What do you mean? The allegations are serious but vague. The timing coincides with your family's recent positive changes. And whoever filed the report seems to have detailed knowledge of your situation without being willing to provide their name. In my experience, that pattern sometimes indicates that someone is using our system to harass a family, rather than genuinely concerned about child welfare. Dillon felt a surge of relief mixed with anger. Relief that Sophie wasn't in danger of being removed from his care, but anger that someone had weaponized Child Protective Services to cause them stress and fear. What happens now? I'll need to interview Sophie when she gets home from school, and I'll be conducting some background checks and reference calls over the next few days. Assuming everything checks out, which I expect it will, this case will be closed as unfounded. But as Kathy packed up her materials and prepared to leave, Dillon couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of their troubles. Not the end. Someone was determined to disrupt their lives, and until he figured out who and why, Sophie would remain vulnerable to future attacks. Harper discovered the truth about the CPS report by accident, during what was supposed to be a routine staff meeting at Westfield General Hospital. She'd been avoiding the executive conference room on the 3rd floor for 2 years, but the monthly nursing staff meeting had been moved there due to construction in their usual space. As Harper took her seat at the large mahogany table, she couldn't help but notice the family photographs on the credenza behind the head. Chair images of Dr. William Thornton at various medical conferences and charity events. What caught her attention wasn't her father's familiar face, but a document lying open on his desk in the adjacent office. Through the glass partition, Harper could clearly see letterhead from the Department of Children and Family Services and Dylan Hayes. Name highlighted in yellow marker. The meeting droned on about staffing schedules and policy updates, but Harper's mind was racing. After 30 minutes of discussion about overtime procedures, she excused herself to use the restroom and instead slipped into her father's office through the connecting door. The CPS report was even worse than she'd imagined. Not only had Dr. Thornton filed the complaint against Dylan, but he'd crafted it with the calculated precision of someone who understood exactly which legislation would trigger the most intensive investigation. Substance abuse, child neglect, financial instability, mental health concerns, every accusation designed to paint Dylan as an unfit parent who posed a danger to Sophie's welfare. But what made Harper's blood run cold was the additional paperwork. Beneath the CPS report, Dr. Thornton had been conducting his own investigation into Dylan's background, complete with employment records, credit reports, and even surveillance photographs of Dylan and Sophie at their apartment complex. The most recent photos showed Harper visiting their apartment, carrying takeout food and art supplies. A handwritten note in her father's distinctive script was clipped to one of the photos. Verify identity of frequent visitor. Potential romantic relationship complicating custody situation. Harper realized with growing horror that her father had been watching Dylan's family for weeks, documenting their lives and looking for ammunition to use against them. Worse, he'd somehow connected Harper to the family without realizing she was his own daughter. The investigation had been triggered by Dylan's advocacy work with Healthcare Justice Coalition work that had brought him to the attention of medical industry leaders who saw patient advocacy as a threat to hospital profit margins. Her hands shaking, Harper photographed the entire file with her phone, then returned to the staff meeting as if nothing had happened. But inside, she was furious and terrified in equal measure. Her father wasn't just attacking Dylan and Sophie, he was attacking them because of their connection to her, because of advocacy work she'd encouraged Dylan to pursue. That evening, Harper drove straight to Dylan's apartment complex, knowing he probably wouldn't want to see her, but unable to stay away when Sophie was in danger. She found Dylan sitting on the small balcony outside his apartment, staring at his phone with an expression of complete defeat. "Dylan," she called softly from the bottom of the stairs. "I need to talk to you. It's about the CPS report." Dylan looked down at her with exhaustion and wariness. "Harper, I told you I needed space." Sophie's confused and hurt enough without. "My father filed the report," Harper interrupted, holding up her phone to show him the photos she'd taken. "Dr. William Thornton. He's been investigating you for weeks." The silence stretched between them as Dylan processed this information. Finally, he stood up and motioned for her to come upstairs. "Sophie's at her friend Emma's house for a sleepover," he said as Harper joined him on the balcony. "Tell me everything." Harper explained what she'd discovered, showing Dylan the surveillance photos and her father's notes about his investigation into Dylan's fitness as a parent. She watched Dylan's expression shift from shock to anger to something that looked like grim determination. "Why?" Dylan asked finally. "Why would your father target us? He doesn't even know you're involved in our lives." "But he knows you're involved in healthcare advocacy," Harper replied. "Dylan, your interviews with Healthcare Justice Coalition have been getting attention from policymakers. You're exactly the kind of articulate, sympathetic spokesperson that hospital administrators fear most, someone who can put a human face on medical debt reform. So he decided to destroy my family to silence me. He decided to prove you're an unfit parent so your advocacy work would lose credibility. Who's going to listen to someone who can't even take care of his own daughter?" Dylan was quiet for several minutes, clearly trying to absorb the implications of what Harper had revealed. What do we do now? How do we fight someone with that kind of power and resources? Harper had been asking herself the same question for the past 3 hours. We tell the truth, publicly. We expose what he's doing and why. Harper, that would destroy your career. Your father would know you've been working at his hospital under a false name. He'd know about the money you gave us, about everything. I don't care about my career, Harper said firmly. I care about Sophie. I care about you. And I care about making sure no other family goes through what you've been put through. Are you sure? Because once we go public with this, there's no going back. Your relationship with your father will be destroyed permanently. Harper looked at Dylan's face in the dim light from the apartment, seeing the strength and integrity that had made her fall in love with him and Sophie in the first place. My relationship with my father was destroyed years ago. But my relationship with your family, that's worth fighting for. The next morning, Harper walked into Dr. Thornton's office without an appointment, placed her hospital ID badge on his desk, and said the words she'd been rehearsing since she was 16 years old. Hello, Dad. We need to talk about Dylan Hayes, Sophie Hayes, and exactly what kind of man you've become. The confrontation in Dr. William Thornton's office lasted exactly 17 minutes, but it changed everything. Harper had walked in prepared for denial, manipulation, or even threats. What she hadn't expected was for her father to immediately recognize her despite 12 years of separation and a different last name. Harper Catherine Thornton, he said without looking up from his computer, his voice carrying the same cold professionalism she remembered from childhood. I wondered when you'd finally work up the courage to show yourself. You knew I worked here? I've known for 2 years. Did you really think you could work in my hospital without me finding out? Dr. Thornton finally looked at her, and Harper was shocked to see how much he'd aged. The question is why you've been hiding like a coward instead of talking to me directly. Because I learned a long time ago that talking to you is pointless, Harper replied, placing the printed photos of his surveillance on his desk. But this isn't about us. This is about Dylan Hayes and his daughter, and the fact that you've been using CPS as a weapon against an innocent family. Dr. Thornton glanced at the photos without surprise. Mr. Hayes is hardly innocent. He's been working with organizations that want to destroy the healthcare industry's ability to provide quality care. Someone needed to remind him that actions have consequences. Actions like what? Sharing his story about medical debt? Advocating for families who can't afford to pay inflated hospital bills? Actions like encouraging government interference in medical pricing, supporting legislation that would bankrupt hospitals, and providing ammunition to politicians who want to socialize medicine. Harper stared at her father, realizing that his attack on Dylan wasn't personal, it was business. You're willing to destroy a family to protect your profit margins? I'm willing to protect an institution that saves lives every day. This hospital employs 800 people and serves 40,000 patients annually. If that requires discouraging a few troublemakers, so be it. Dylan Hayes isn't a troublemaker. He's a father who almost lost his daughter because he couldn't afford proper medical care earlier. He's exactly the kind of person you should be helping, not attacking. And you're exactly the kind of naive idealist your mother was, Dr. Thornton replied, always putting individual feelings above larger responsibilities. The mention of her mother broke something open in Harper's chest. Don't you dare talk about Mom. You weren't there when she died, remember? You were too busy protecting your larger responsibilities to be there for your own family. Your mother's death was a tragedy, but it doesn't change the fact that this hospital... Stop. Harper's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. Just stop. I don't care about your justifications or your hospital's mission statement. I care about an 8-year-old girl whose father is being terrorized by false accusations because you're threatened by his advocacy work. Dr. Thornton leaned back in his chair, studying Harper with the calculating expression she remembered from childhood arguments. What do you want? I want you to call CPS and withdraw your complaint. I want you to stop investigating Dylan's family. And I want you to leave them alone permanently. And if I refuse? Harper had been dreading this moment, but she'd made her choice the night before on Dylan's balcony. Then I'll call Healthcare Justice Coalition myself. I'll tell them exactly who I am, exactly what you've done, and exactly what kind of man owns this hospital. Dylan's story is already compelling weight. Until they hear about the hospital owner who filed false CPS reports to silence patient advocates. The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Dr. Thornton picked up his phone and dialed a number Harper recognized from her own recent experience. Ms. Thorne? This is Dr. William Thornton. I need to withdraw the complaint. I filed regarding Dylan Hayes. Yes, I realize it's unusual. New information has come to light that makes the complaint unnecessary. Yes, today. After ending the call, Dr. Thornton looked at Harper with something that might have been respect. You've grown up to be just as stubborn as your mother. Thank you, Harper said simply. 3 weeks later, the scene at Boston Common was picture perfect. Dylan was pushing Sophie on the swings, while Harper sat on a nearby bench, sketching their interaction in the small notebook she'd started carrying. Everywhere, Sophie's laughter echoed across the playground as Dylan struggled to push the swing high enough to satisfy his daredevil daughter. The CPS investigation had been officially closed as unfounded within days of Dr. Thornton's withdrawal. Kathy Thorne had even called Dylan personally to apologize for the stress the investigation had caused and to commend him on being one of the most dedicated fathers she'd encountered in 15 years of social work. Harper had resigned from Westfield General the day after confronting her father, but Healthcare Justice Coalition had immediately offered her a position as Director of Patient Family Services. The job paid less than nursing, but felt infinitely more meaningful. She spent her days helping families navigate medical debt, insurance appeals, and hospital billing departments, using her inside knowledge of the healthcare industry to level the playing field for vulnerable patients. Dylan had been promoted to site supervisor at Henderson Construction after his former company saw news coverage of his advocacy work and realized they'd been foolish to let him go. The promotion came with a significant salary increase and health insurance that would actually cover Sophie's medical needs if she ever needed surgery again. But the most important change was the one Sophie had drawn in her latest artwork: 3 figures holding hands in front of a house, with the words "My Real Family" written in careful 8-year-old handwriting. Harper, Dylan called from the swings. Sophie wants to know if you're coming to her piano recital next week. Wouldn't miss it, Harper replied, looking up from her sketch with a smile that felt like sunshine. As she watched Dylan help Sophie down from the swing and saw the little girl run toward her with arms outstretched, Harper realized that sometimes the family you choose is even stronger than the family you're born into. Come on, Sophie announced, taking both adults by the hand. Let's go home. And for the first time in her life, Harper knew exactly where home was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.